Darts. Darts.
Pasted that line up.
I've done something wrong. You have to be patient with me.
We're here to support you, Joe, not judge you.
Okay, I think I fixed it. Okay, we are now live on YouTube.
Hello and welcome. I'm Becky with Malvern Books. We're very happy to be with you this evening for another installment of Austin Community College Creative Writing Department's Literary Coffeehouse and Open Mic. Our host is ACC's Charlotte Gullick, and their featured writer this evening is Jedah Mayberry. Charlotte is the chair of the Creative Writing Department at Austin Community College. She holds an MA in Creative Writing from UC Davis and an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her first novel, By Way of Water, was chosen by Jane Ann Phillips as a grand prize winner of the Santa Fe Writers Project. Her other awards include a Colorado Council on the Arts Fellowship for Poetry, Ragdale Residency, and the Evergreen State College 2012 Teacher Excellence Award. Charlotte, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I want to say happy Ramadan, if that is part of the way that you connect to the spirit world. I have family that are observing, and we lived with them when they celebrated Ramadan, and I'm amazed at how gracious they were when they were fasting. I don't know if I'm that gracious even when I have food. And I think it's important to mark those things. If you've been to one of these events, you've heard me say before that Malvern Books is an extremely important bookstore in our community. And if you are able to support them, they only carry independently published books. And it is hard right now in COVID. So if you're thinking of getting an independently published book, please consider going to Malvern. A couple quick announcements. On May 10th, we hope to have another literary coffee house that was canceled because of the freeze. So on May 10th, we hope to have Jacob Grovey share his work. I hope you all can come that night. And we have great creative writing classes at Austin Community College. They're small, they're supportive, they help us understand what it means to be a literary citizen. I think as Jedah said earlier, every writer is a reader. We'll talk more about how important that is. Registration for summer classes is now open. So I'll read Jedah's bio, and then he will read, and I'll ask him a few questions. And then it's an open mic. So if you would like to read, you will put your name in the chat, and I'll keep the list, and you have 4 minutes to read. I'm really grateful that we have Jedah here tonight. I heard him speak as part of a big event with KAZI, Diverse Celebration of Voices. And I was really struck by his writing and the power with which he reads. So I will read his bio and then we can get to it. So Jedah Mayberry was raised in southeastern Connecticut, the backdrop for his fiction debut. The Unheralded King of Preston Plains Middle won grand prize in Red City Review's 2015 Book Awards and was named first in multicultural fiction for 2014 by the Texas Association of Authors. In 2018, he completed a Hurston-Wright Foundation Workshop in fiction, used in part to revise the manuscript that resulted in a second book, Sun is Sky, due from Jacaranda Books. His work has appeared at Linden Avenue, Brittle Paper, Black Elephant, Akashic Fri-SciFi Series, Solstice Magazine, permission to write, and a gathering together among others. Jedah resides with his wife and 2 daughters in Austin, Texas. So please send your silent welcome to Jedah. Thank you for being here tonight. And what you going to read first, sir?
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Charlotte. Just wanted to echo what Charlotte said about Austin is a great, book place to be, between independent bookstores, ACC and the Creative Writing Program, the Book Festival, the Writers League of Texas. This has been a great place to be, a great place to have launched a first book and to still be writing. So I'm going to start with the first book, The Unheralded King of Preston Plains Middle. And I'm going to, in the interest of time and just also in the interest of not wanting to give away any spoilers, I'm going to hopscotch around a little bit. And I apologize, my better camera is over my head, so the entire time I'm going to be looking down and not looking directly at the camera, but hopefully you'll forgive me. So the Unheralded King is really, I tell you in the very first page that a mother has lost her eldest son, and the other son has lost his only brother. And the story is really about, though I take you through kind of a long drawn out, we eventually, discover what's come of the older brother Langston. To me, the story really jumps off with Trajan, the younger brother, because now he's left in the world to navigate on his own. He doesn't have his older brother to draft behind, and his mother has disappeared in the shadows. So we kind of pick up with him at his mother's door, and this is called Silent Walls. Ma, Trajan exclaimed over his shoulder, hoping to send the words down the hallway and around the corner into his mother's bedroom. Where are my white socks, he asked. I don't believe I'm wearing any socks, she announced, tossing the covers aside, contented by the sight of her bare feet staring back at her. I didn't accuse you of wearing them, he replied, burying his elbows deeper into his top dresser drawer. He took care to pull his voice back inside his own room. He had been left to converse with silent walls since his brother's passing. He poked his head inside his mother's doorway earlier that morning, asked whether she wanted some breakfast. She thanked him for being so considerate, sending a fleeting smile in the direction of the open door frame. But no, she didn't need anything to eat. At least she was talking today, sitting upright for a change, her pink robe adding light to the room. He didn't want to risk upsetting her with the drudgery of life's mundane little details. The likelihood that he would miss his soccer match if he couldn't find his white socks was not the concern he wished to see push his mother back into the shadows. His mother had been his brother's biggest fan, with Trajan close on her heels. She nurtured the bond between mother and sons, spending time with each in carefully measured doses to ensure that either child got equal shine. But Langston, the older by a full 3 years, held a direct line to her heart. The bright beam of her happiness rippled inside of him, rippled, then sank. And again, to me, this is where the story really jumps off. So this is where we leave Trajan in the world alone. His mother's locked herself away in her room, and he gets into all kinds of trouble. And it's our job to try to get him back home. So among the trouble he gets into, he's taken up with one of his high school teachers in a less than appropriate manner. So we find him on this night caught in the middle of, or the start of, a snowstorm, trying to make his way home from 2 towns away at his teacher's house. So it's just starting off, heading out when it started to rain. The kind of rain that's falling only to allow time for the temperature to drop, for that penetrating chill to set in, to summon the sleet to follow. It's like the sky was filled with machinery, and the part responsible for wrecking Trajan's night was just winding up. A white owl whispered past as he reached the roadway heading back across town. The cut of its wings angled for distance, not for stealth. The owl carried in its talons a long, delicate string, pulling in its weight a sheet of white snow. Ghoulish flakes cloaked the night sky in dense, fluttering swells that littered Trajan's path in a haphazard pattern of inverted paw prints, layered on top of one another in any place the ground was already moist. The clouds needed to shed excess snow production before a normal snowfall could proceed. Trajan took a shortcut through Fort Shantok, the Indian burial ground, figuring the heavy tree covering would protect him from the sky's wrath. He hoped that Grandpa Tuke's ancestors would find some way to excuse his transgressions, that they might safeguard the balance of his journey home. He came upon a mound of snow as he listened for a response, the wind rustling the tree branches to acknowledge his pleas. A fallen animal, he surmised, caught unaware by the sudden onset of winter. As he stepped to get a closer look, he tumbled across a second mound, heavy like the first, only bigger. He scrambled to his knees, struggling in the dim light to make out the animal, the full length of its body crumpled on top of itself, appendages strewn at crazy angles, showing the desperation of its failed attempt to flee, the violence that marked its fated end. He crept over and knelt beside the thing, looking for a snout to see if its muzzle was still warm. He pulled at the end he presumed was the animal's head to find the sleeve of a yellow goose-down jacket. A bulky silver watch hung loosely at the end of a slender wrist, turned over on itself, cracked in two from the impact. Trajan rocked back on his heels to get a broader view. The man's knees were tucked beneath him, his hips angled skyward like he had been rear-ended by a train. Death stomping life into the dirt and leaving its latest victim in a crumpled heap. Pools of dark blood stained the shell of the man's yellow jacket, ketchup and eggs the way Chester and Grandpa Took liked them. Trajan spun backward, stumbling over his feet, trying to put distance between himself and the dead man. He turned back in the direction of the first mound, noticed steam rising from it. The mound was still moving, still working to escape. He found a woman lying beneath a beard of blanketed snow, a second victim, one-eyed begging for it to be over. Trajan crouched beside her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered, brushing snow from the woman's face. She let out a gasp as Trajan lifted a thick tangle of braids from around her neck, sending a small flurry of snow in the air beneath her. He rolled the woman over on her shoulders, positioning her face up to help her breathe. "I'm going to get you some help," he assured the woman, who lay expressionless, both eyes trained on him, when the pounding of feet came charging from the direction of the park entrance. The chatter of police radio was evident above the sound of the officer's hard charging, implements of his trade jangling beneath the waist of his short coat, indicating that winter had also caught him unprepared for the season's first earnest offensive. Trajan made himself small, light, as he darted toward the woods in search of cover. He noticed prints in the snow ahead of him as his feet left the gravel footpath. Heard feet shuffling for position along the thin ledge, resting a few footfalls beyond the jagged edge of the pathway. He took heed as hushed whispers in Haitian Creole rustled in the darkness. Trajan didn't speak Creole, but owing to a couple of recent recruits to the soccer team, he recognized it when spoken. Trajan retreated in the direction of the police chatter, hands above his head, screaming at the top of his lungs. "I didn't do this. It wasn't me." "Stop where you are," the officer commanded, his weapon drawn, "and keep those hands where I can see them." A second officer arrived, placing himself between Trajan and his partner's gun sight. Give us your name, son," he instructed, a hand resting loose against the butt of his 9mm. Trajan mostly saw the uniform, the proximity of his hand to his weapon, the flop of his tongue as he spoke, his lip lost beneath a heavy brown mustache, the dusting of snow gathering on the top of his hat. He refastened the buckle on his holster and extended a hand, pulling Trajan to him. He told Trajan to put his arms down after a brief search of his pockets and asked him to produce some ID. The other officer closed in on them, his gun lowered but still resting firmly in hand. "You care to tell us what you're doing out here?" he demanded, adrenaline filling his voice with an abundance of undue energy. "I was taking the shortcut home," Trajan responded, fidgeting, wondering when they were going to ask about the woman lying a few short steps away. "What shortcut? Sylvia Lane is that way, little homie," the officer scoffed, pointing over his shoulder with the barrel of his gun. "Stand down, Rodriguez," his partner instructed. Rodriguez threw his hands up. "I'll leave you to it," he said, turning his back to them. He holstered his gun and lit a cigarette. He continued to turn small circles in the snow a short distance away from them, smoke from his cigarette mixing with the crystalline night air. Officer Rodriguez was a local product, having grown up in New London in the shadow of the Crystal Avenue apartments. His own Sylvia Lane, a short drive away, breeding contempt for all he mistook Trajan to represent. He had been cited twice for overzealousness in carrying out his duties, the department receiving countless citizen complaints on the heels of his antics. He had never fired his service weapon in the line of duty, though he desperately hoped for the chance to fight crime someday and have the boys in blue come out on top. Officer Haley resumed questioning Trajan. "Where's your home, son?" Trajan pointed to the far end of the park. "I live in Preston." "Do you know the deceased?" the officer questioned. "No, but I think the woman is still alive," Trajan responded, starting toward the place he'd left her, lying face up, laboring with every breath. "Stay here," Officer Hadley advised, grabbing Trajan by the shoulder as Officer Rodriguez charged ahead of them, his weapon again in hand. A lit cigarette lay smoldering inside a series of neatly drawn circles that Rodriguez had made in the snow with his feet. He checked her pulse with one hand, while the other hand scanned the tree line for movement along the barrel of his gun. Rodriguez circled the air with his fingers, signaling to his partner that the woman was still breathing. Hadley radioed for an ambulance. "I need her to run full sirens," he advised, encouraging EMS to hustle. "We may have a live victim." Trajan recognized that he meant to say witness, the woman's condition having been of marginal interest just 30 seconds prior. Within minutes, the park was swarming with activity. Firemen, paramedics, police backup, the squadron leader. Even if the victims were of little consequence, efforts to identify the person and persons responsible for the shooting drew loud ministration. Officer Haley held Trajan apart from the commotion. Meanwhile, Rodriguez buzzed around the scene, working to keep himself at the center of attention. Trajan watched as paramedics unfolded the man's body, scooped the remnants of the train wreck into a dark plastic bag, zippered it shut. Trajan thought about his brother, wondered if Langston had seen the inside of a body bag as they loaded the man inside a coroner's van. Trajan caught sight of the woman again as they wheeled her on a gurney toward a waiting ambulance. They locked eyes one last time. Her eyes thanked him and didn't thank him. The care he showed for her well-being had been generous, but he had done her no kindness, leaving her to stand witness for a crime that had nearly succeeded in taking her life. Her man bagged and carted away. She too may have been better off dead. Officer Haley had a patrol car drive Trajan across the river to the town line. When the car had left, Trajan continued on foot, the snow having found a steady rhythm beneath a cowering sky. The soft snow cover absorbed any semblance of sound, wrapping Trajan in a heavy cocoon. He used the layers of white to silence his anxieties. Each footstep seemed to last a small eternity. He'd imagined death 100 times, had pictured countless victims on the verge of slipping free of the hold their earthly existence had on them. He had never before encountered a dead body in the flesh, a person there in one instant and then gone the next. He tried to erase the image from his memory as he continued toward home. 100 yards from his mother's front door, a white Mercedes approached him. "Big guy," a voice called from the passenger seat as the window slithered open. "Let me chat with you. What you seen back there in the park tonight needed doing. Simple as that. But that don't make me no bad man, you understand?" The man's heavy accent rested beneath a tongue accustomed to speaking Creole almost exclusively. "You did good, brethren," he offered, "placing tracks on top of my tracks till I ain't had no tracks. I am in your debt, Manfred, my brother. Call on Lucia should you need anything." The car U-turned in front of Trajan, creating a pair of high rooster tails as the rear tires scrambled for grip, then eased off, its paint blending with the falling snowfall like a ghost ride, there and not there when you look for it a second time. And that is a little excerpt from The Unheralded King. And I apologize to anyone if I didn't forewarn you that there's a little bit of violence, but this is, to me, an example of a young man who has been left to find his way alone. And 14, 15, 16-year-olds, we tend to find our way into trouble. So that is The Unheralded King. And I want to briefly read a bit from Sun is Sky. And Sun is Sky, for anyone who wasn't here at the very beginning, it's about a young woman, but it's really about the circle of mothering, from mother to daughter, back around to grandmother. There are no three women who are more alike, but they work desperately to distance themselves from each other's ways. So the book is really about, this one character, her attempt to, find herself in the examples she sees in her mother, in the examples she sees in her grandmother, And in the end, she realizes that you can't separate sun from sky, hence the title, Sun is Sky. So this chapter, anyone who's seen my work, I'm a big fan of titles and subtitles and sub-subtitles. But this chapter is entitled Women's Business, and the beginning is called Anybody. Miss Penny. Yes, sir. Your grandmama sent me to fetch you. You know my grandmother? There ain't a soul alive in this town that doesn't know your grandmother. He took the wheel with both hands and steered the car across an uneven span of railroad track. Another handful of lazy turns delivered us at Graham's front door. The man rattled the shift knob between gears, the purr of the engine idling ahead of us. This is as far as he intended to carry me. I appreciate you coming to get me, he stammered, pulling my suitcase from the backseat of his car. Just repaying a favor, he replied, already eyeing the series of turns he would make on his way back into town. Can I tell my grandma who dropped me? She'll be looking for you, not for me, he insisted. Could have been anybody who dropped you. He fiddled with the gear shift again and shooed me away with a tilt of his head. Now go on inside and make yourself at home. Your grandma, she'll be alone directly. This is tomorrow's sun. The year I was to turn 15, I was sent to live with my maternal grandmother in Picayune, Mississippi. The kind of place that time moves slow on. Drug a long finger across her skin, left a smudge. I had never known such a place. They have something down here called a stink bug, claimed to possess as its special power the ability to put up a stifling odor, meant to warn other stink bugs of impending danger, but only after it's been squashed. I've come to think of myself as a sort of stink bug, cast from my home to serve warning for my two younger sisters, who are left to endure whatever threat I am supposed to be fleeing. How the perils in Mississippi are meant to be any less than those in New York is beyond me. My first full day in Picayune, two of the local boys got it in their heads to wet me with their water guns. Their eyes gleamed with the thrill of each squirt aimed in my direction, the air filled with the sound of their taunting. I stood staring, wondering what those boys meant to accomplish by wetting me until my dress was a tattered mass of jet stream tears. My hair lifted in several places, water dripping down either side of my face from make-believe wounds. The boys eventually grew tired of me, a moving target that wouldn't seem to move, and continued on their way, shooting streams of water at the ground, at each other, into the wind. My grandmother, who witnessed the attack from her porch window, told me to warn those boys the next time they attempt to squirt me that I will lift my dress and make it rain on the whole world. She sent word by way of their mothers or grandmothers, whoever most held sway over the root of their devilment. She battered her eyes against a persistent sun, hung the message on the edge of a tilted sky, listing from the weight of the burden it was sent to deliver. By nightfall that evening, the sky was alive with the spectacles of events leading up to a storm. The low rumbling of thunder escalates to a bone-rattling clap. The scent of rain, as yet unseen, transported on steam-drenched billows of wind. A hollow brightness filled the sky, giving some hint as to the celestial whereabouts of the storm's inception. Together, the storm's way of proclaiming, ready or not, here I come. A flash of light ruptured the soft underbelly of swollen cloud cover, and the rains began to fall. In gargantuan droplets at first, fit, spark, splook. Obviously from a common source, yet strangely isolated in the onset. The rain eventually settled into a steady rhythm, the downpour having worn smooth the frayed edges of ruptured sky. I screwed up my nerve to ask the question through Graham's cracked bedroom door as she and I settled down for the night. Was all this my doing, I asked, above the patter of raindrops keeping time on the rooftop. Silly girl, she replied, the titter in her voice showing the faintest hint of delight at the prospect that her words had carried. That her eldest granddaughter had grown to consider another person's way of seeing the world, an outlook that had eluded my mother under the same teaching. Magnificent forces exist out there, she explained, sunshine, lightning, drops of rain, the rainbows they conspire to produce. Vital forces as undeniable as you and me, yet none of them is small enough to fit between the tips of your fingers. The sky might on occasion heed your wishes, but it will never bow to your will. It's best you flush any such notion from inside your fertile mind. She switched off the light, resting on her bedside table before I could manage a response. The night air placed a hush over the space surrounding us. signaling it was time for sleep, not time for any further question asking about sunshine or rain or the sky's regard for my wishes one way or the other. I lay nestled in the covers, contemplating my connection to those magnificent outside forces. Had I been older, I would have recognized the coincidence between the timing of the threatgram prescribed and the start of the rainy season in the Mississippi Bayou. Any younger, and I wouldn't have appreciated the kind of mojo a threat like this, mired in sexual innuendo, would have on the locals, the men especially. Evening, miss. The man tipped his hat, resting a foot on the porch step. A lazy arm stretched along the length of the handrail. Is the sun going to shine tomorrow? He asked. His eyes as wet as any part of the sky, the brim of his hat, the tip of his boot. It didn't shine today, I replied. Might not shine tomorrow either, I told him, reciting the words Graham had scripted for me. Each night, somebody stopped by to ask about tomorrow's sun. Not always the same somebody, but every night without fail, somebody came to ask. And that is Sun and Sky. Thank you all.
Fantastic, Jedah.
Thank you.
I wrote down so many notes. Was that line you just read, his eyes as wet as any part of the sky?
That's right.
Oh, dang. So good. Okay, I have a few questions for you, but first,
Sure.
Thank you so much for reading to us and reading from 2 books so we could really get a sense of your versatility as a writer. So you said something that blew me away, and I would like you to ask you about this. When you said you were doing the setup for the Unheralded King, you said it's our job to get him back home. And so I don't know if you remember saying this, but I'm just thinking about, so like, do you see that the reader's responsibility is just, I mean, can we talk about that a little bit? When you said it's our job to see him back home, I fell in love with that idea. So I was wondering if you could talk about it a little more.
Yeah, and to me, any story that you write, any story that you tell, it's only partly told when it's written, once the words fall on the page. But the rest of the story comes about when the person reads it. The Unheralded King, people have reacted over the years from different perspectives. There were some people who are, my hope was that it was going to appeal to young men and it would be a cautionary tale. They'd read this and see, hey, stay a little bit closer to home. Don't get, a little bit, just don't get out there on your own. But it turns out that, mothers have read it and really responded to it, because I don't talk about the mother very much other than the opening passage. As we go throughout the book, we learn more and more about her. But to me, it's at the end, everyone is pulling for this kid, his friends, his mother. There's a Grandpa Took. Every story I write, most every story I write, tends to have, a protagonist, a younger person, and a grandmother or a grandfather. And I just find that there are ways to say things through a grandparent's, lens or voice that is not so easy for a younger person to say. But I see the reader as participating in, hopefully they're rooting for this kid and they hope that he makes it, and hope they stay, to the end of the story to see, did he get out? And if he got out, how he got out.
Just the idea that like the co-creation of reader and writer.
That's right. Yeah.
It's just fantastic.
Yeah.
So you write a lot, it seems like, with a respect for and a desire to articulate relationships to the spirit world. And how do you go about that? How do you do that with respect? I mean, it sounds like you checked in with some tribal people about the cover.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, and we're all guided in some way. And there are some people who are, overtly Christian and they look to God for guidance, for leadership. There are other people who maybe less so, but it's, I think it's, very arrogant to say, I got here on my own. I'm going to make it on my own. I'm going to make every decision on my own. And I would hope that people look to something larger than themselves to look to. I've got one piece. I don't know if we're going to talk about things that, are coming, but there's something that I published probably 2.5, 3 years ago. And it was extracted from the Unheralded King. This drug dealer, Lucius Brand, he's larger than life. And after I finished the book, he just kept speaking to me and kept bouncing around my head. And I wrote this piece that A Gathering Together, published in 3 parts. And it was about 3 men facing the prospect of entering heaven. And one was Lucius Brand's, just a corner boy, a drug runner. And he and his conscience were sitting there hoping to get in, just hoping he hadn't done too much to prevent him from getting in. There's a newspaper reporter who also appears in the book, but he's older and he knows he's getting in. He just can't wait to see his dearly departed wife. And then there's a third man, Lucius Brand's right hand, who he's not Christian. He doesn't believe in Christianity. And he believes his spirits float above you to keep the rest of his family safe. So he's just hoping to look out for his mother and his sister back in Haiti. But it all speaks to some spirituality. There's something larger than ourselves that guides our steps. And I don't presume to know everyone's beliefs, but I try to instill in every character, something. I don't want people to be single-minded, and when they make, missteps and do crazy things, you have no choice but to either blame them or blame the person who wrote it. And I don't want to take the blame, so give them some other guidance.
Great, thank you. How did you write female characters?
That question comes up a lot.
And have you gotten feedback on the accuracy of that?
Yeah, the question comes up a lot. I actually, half vaccinated. I went to check on my mother and my grandmother last week. So it's been really hard trying to keep my accent. It's very Connecticut right now. And I'm trying to read Picayune, Mississippi. I'm living in Texas. But my mother asked the same question. And I asked her, where did I grow up? I grew up with my mother, my grandmother, my sister. In my house, I have a wife and 2 daughters. My wife has a couple of sisters. We have a female dog. It's just, I associate with, it's partly paying attention. One writer that I really admire is Jesmyn Ward. And she writes men, women, she writes everyone, but she's respectful of, independent of who she's writing, even a not so great guy, she's respectful of how did they get there? How did they arrive on the page? And that's what I was trying to do, trying to embody this young woman and, think how she might react as a 14, 15, 16-year-old girl, how she might react to some of the things she's confronted with, including just the dislocation, being moved from New York to Mississippi. That is sort of universal. But, getting inside her psyche was partly from studying the people that I'm around every day.
Did you say to your mom that you live with a female dog and that's how you could write female
I
characters?
did not.
Okay, good.
I'm still here. I'm still breathing. So I didn't say that. I gave her, my grandmother, my sister, majority credit.
Probably as it should be.
Yes.
I just have 2 more questions
Sure.
for you. When did you first know that you were a writer? Was it a defining moment or was it an accumulation of moments?
Really an accumulation. And I searched and searched for this quote and I finally found it. Ira Glass said something about creatives and that part of what draws you in as a creative is having good taste. So having seen good writing or good, storytelling or movie making, whatever the case may be. So it partly came from reading, and I started just noodling around. What really drew me in is, I went to, again, I mentioned I'm an engineer by trade. So I went through years and years of college and equations and numbers, and I still do that for a living. And I needed another creative outlet. And I started reading, and the first thing that I read that really, really resonated with me was Edwidge Danticat, The Farming of Bones. And I decided after reading that, I cannot write. I'm never going to attempt to write. There's just no point in this. But I just kept reading and kept looking at things. I actually returned to the first page of her book. And it starts out something like, he came to me and she's talking about this person she's in love with. And it's just in that one page, you feel this intense love for this person. The next book that really told me I needed to write was Wally Lamb, I Know This Much Is True. And he writes about, I think he calls it 3 Rivers, Connecticut. But when you look at the places, the beaches he went to, the road he went down, he is very much in the Norwich, New London area. And he depicted a character, Ralph Drinkwater, who was described as being of, native and, part native, part white, part black. But he painted this guy with such a put him in such a narrow box. I thought, I've seen this guy. I grew up with this guy. I know who this guy is. You missed it. You didn't get it right at all. And I just felt if people of color are going to be represented, people of color need to tell their stories. And that's what inspired me too. And then I went off and I took a class at Emory University while we were in Atlanta. I've taken a workshop here, hosted by American Short Fiction, and just learned as much as I could about the craft and continuing to learn and continuing to workshop, but just feel like there are stories in me that need to be told.
Thank you that you stuck with it. And I
Yes.
love that thing about like when somebody gets it wrong, who's going to get
Yeah.
it right?
Yeah.
So like being beholden to the characters is really motivating.
Right.
I would ask you a cajillion questions, but I guess my last one is, what are you working on currently?
I am, in addition to trying to get Sun and Sky, improve availability stateside, I've kind of steered more in the direction of sci-fi. And sci-fi allows a couple of things. One is it allows my engineering brain and my writing brain to work together, to cooperate and in agreement that they're going to work together. And I get to invent things and, create systems of transportation and all sorts of things. But it's also the one thing I find in literary fiction is that, there's a message, there's an overarching theme that carries the book forward, but things are kind of subtle, a bit muted. The characters have ideas and they can express ideas, but sci-fi, I can take a stance on something, global warming, and I can write an entire narrative around what is the impact of global warming, how has it affected us. So I've got a couple of things that one set in, again, a young girl and her grandmother are in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I wanted a place that was wet, like Austin, a river runs through it, and they are affected by repeated flooding. There's something else that I'm working on now that's set more in the Delaware area, not as much about warming, but it's really about I'm doing it in cooperation with someone, and the challenge that was presented to me is to really think about what's beyond where we are. There's a shift happening right now. The shift is happening more slowly than some people would like, but what is it going to look like when we're on the other side of that? So I'm writing something now that is trying to explore, what does this post-society look like? And then I've got a handful of short stories that are kind of bubbling around. I'm hoping to get published. There's one that is in direct response to the George Floyd murder. And I have a young Black teacher who begins teaching middle school at the start of the 2019-2020, school year. And, midway through the spring semester, he has to, help the kids navigate the move to online schooling. And just after Memorial Weekend, during a Zoom session, his kids discovered the George Floyd video on their cell phones. And it's his job to help them unravel that, including the lone Black kid in the class. I describe him as cat whiskers and a bowl of fresh milk. And to me, that's something, particularly in a short story, I can take a stance. I can kind of let my feelings bleed through a little bit and not have it directly come through the characters. So that one is hopefully coming.
Well, and that makes me want to ask you one more question is, and it's a difficult question to ask, but like, how do you take care of yourself when you're writing the really intense stuff?
One thing that lockdown has helped is that I can be even more isolated than I ordinarily would be. And not having to go into work and face people and pretend I'm all right or not be all right, and then have them wonder, is what's going on with him? Have me wonder, do they see it the same way I do? So I can be in isolation and I can react as I need to react. The other thing that I've done is a couple of things that I've written. Probably the first 5 or 6 times I read through that George Floyd piece, I broke down in tears. I don't know if I could read it live somewhere because it just tore me apart. And I in particular wanted to enter the story. I didn't want to tell the story from the cop's perspective. I didn't want to tell the story from the perspective of anyone on the scene, but take a middle school kid who's already grappling with where do I belong in the world? Where do I belong in this classroom? And have him witness that in a live Zoom session in front of everybody he knows. And so part of taking care of myself is letting myself feel it, letting it tear me apart. There's even a scene in, Sun and Sky where I talk about just the father and him getting just a private moment with his daughter and helping her deal with something she's gone through. And he calls her his baby girl, and it tears me up every time. So I let myself feel.
That was a tough question. Thank you
No
for
problem.
answering it.
No problem.
In my writing classes, we talk a lot about how do we have a sustainable writing life, and the myth of the self-destructive alone writer is really not helpful.
Right.
And so we talk a lot about self-care, and you've really given us some great access. We won't answer the phone right now. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
It's been really great to talk to you tonight, and your generosity of story, but also accessing your process is really great. And
Sure.
I didn't realize so much family is here. So I hope I don't get you in trouble for the dog comment later. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's just really powerful what you just shared. I'm just thinking about that. Let ourselves feel it as a part of the care.
Yeah.
So now in a very awkward transition, we're going to go to the open mic. So if you are someone who's interested in reading tonight, you sign up in the chat. You have 4 minutes to read. Malvern has some wonderful guidelines for reading, and that includes that you are judicious in what you choose to share. And this includes no rape or torture, racially influenced profanity. Of course, if those are things that you need to put into your work, that is up to you. But being mindful that what we choose to read in public can be activating or triggering for other people. So choosing your work with care. And I just really appreciate that Malvern has taken a stand on this and allowed us to be a part of setting those guidelines for community, particularly because we have a lot of students, and learning how to be a good literary citizen is something that does